They say the winter of 1,887 inches Wyoming didn't just kill men, it buried their secrets. When Clara Holloway walked into her barn that freezing Tuesday morning, she wasn't looking for romance. She was looking for a way to save her mother's starving cattle. Instead, she found a man bleeding out in the hay, a man with a Colt .45, a bag full of stolen cash, and a bullet lodged near his heart. She didn't know it then, but saving his life would cost her everything she thought she knew about her father's death. This isn't a fairy tale. This is the true, untold story of the widow's daughter and the outlaw who loved her. The wind howled through the cracks of the Holloway barn like a dying wolf. It was the 14th of November, 1887, in the high country of Blackwood Creek, Wyoming. The mercury had dropped so low the glass in the thermometer looked ready to shatter. Clara Holloway, 22 and hardened by a life that hadn't been kind, shoved the heavy oak door open against a drift of snow. She wrapped her woolen shawl tighter around her shoulders, her breath plumed in the freezing air, disappearing into the dark rafters of the barn. "Easy, Bess," she whispered to the milk cow, who was shifting nervously in her stall. Clara grabbed the pitchfork. Her hands were raw. The skin cracked from the dry cold and the lye soap she used to wash laundry for the miners in town to make ends meet. Since her father, Samuel Holloway, had died in a riding accident 2 years ago, the ranch had fallen into ruin. Her mother, Margaret, was a shadow of herself, consumed by grief and the looming debt note held by the town's wealthiest man, Marshal Jedediah Rourke. Clara stabbed the pitchfork into the hay pile in the far corner, intending to toss feed to the horses. Clink. The tines hit something hard. Not wood, not the floor. It sounded like metal striking metal. She frowned, pulling the fork back. She dug deeper, tossing aside the dry yellow stalks. Then she saw it. A boot, a spur, silver and tarnished, etched with a pattern she didn't recognize. Clara gasped, stumbling back. A man lay buried beneath the hay. He was face down, his leather duster coat caked in frost and dark, wet patches that hadn't frozen yet. Blood, panic, cold and sharp, spiked in her chest. She should run. She should get the shotgun from the house. But Clara was her father's daughter, curious and stubborn. She dropped the pitchfork and knelt, rolling the stranger over with a grunt of effort. He was heavy, built like the mountains themselves. His face was pale, covered in a week's worth of dark stubble, his lips blue from the cold and blood loss. He looked dead, but then his eyelids fluttered. A hand, calloused and stained with gunpowder, shot out and gripped her wrist with a strength that terrified her. "Don't," he wheezed, his voice sounding like gravel grinding together. "Don't. Tell the marshal. Who are you?" Clara demanded, though her voice shook. "Silas," he whispered, his eyes rolling back as his grip slackened. "Just Silas." Clara looked down at his chest. His shirt was soaked red on the left side. He'd been shot. Recently, she looked toward the barn door. If she went to town for Doc Sivers, the marshal would hear of it. Marshal Rourke kept a tight leash on Blackwood Creek. If this man was running from Rourke, he was likely a criminal. But as she looked at his face, a face etched with pain, yet strangely lacking the cruelty she saw in the men at the saloon, she hesitated. "Mama's going to kill me," she muttered. She couldn't leave him here to freeze. And she couldn't turn him in. Not with that desperation in his voice. Clara grabbed him by the shoulders. He was dead weight. "Wake up, cowboy," she hissed. "I can't drag you alone." He didn't wake, but he groaned. Using every ounce of strength she had, fueled by adrenaline, Clara managed to drag him toward the back of the barn, into the old tack room where they kept the spare blankets and the wood stove used for calving season. She bolted the tack room door from the inside. She lit the small stove, the smell of burning cedar filling the small space. Then she took her knife and cut open his shirt. The wound was ugly, a jagged hole just below his collarbone. "You're lucky, Silas," she whispered, her hands trembling as she reached for a bottle of horse liniment and a clean rag. "An inch lower, and you'd be meeting your maker." Outside, the wind screamed louder, masking the sound of horses approaching the main house. Clara froze. She knew that hoofbeat cadence. It was Rourke's men. She blew out the lantern, plunging the room into darkness, leaving only the red glow of the stove embers. She held her breath, her hand resting inadvertently on the stranger's chest. His heart was beating slow, thready. But there, a heavy fist pounded on the barn door outside. "Miss Holloway," a voice boomed. It was Deputy Cletus, a man with a mind as dull as a rusted spoon but a trigger finger that was dangerously fast. "We're looking for a fugitive." "You got anyone in there?" Clara looked at Silas. If she stayed silent, they might break the door down. If she answered, she had to lie perfectly. She stood up, smoothed her dress, and unbolted the tack room door, stepping out into the main barn just as the main doors creaked open. Light from Deputy Cletus's lantern flooded the barn, blinding Clara for a moment. She raised a hand to shield her eyes, feigning annoyance rather than terror. "Cletus creates enough noise to wake the dead," Clara snapped, grabbing a bucket. "What do you mean by barging in here? My mother is asleep." Cletus sat atop his horse, forcing the animal into the center of the barn. He looked down at her, his eyes scanning the shadows. "Marshal's orders. Miss Clara. Bank robber hit the Cheyenne transport yesterday. Tracked him this way. He's bleedin'. Thought he might have holed up. In my barn?" Clara scoffed. "The only thing bleeding in here is Bess's udder if I don't milk her soon. Look around. If you find a bank robber, let me know. I could use the reward money to pay your boss the interest we owe him." Cletus narrowed his eyes. He dismounted, his boots crunching on the hay. He walked a slow circle around the barn. He paused near the tack room door. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. "Please don't go in there. Please." "What's in there?" Cletus pointed a gloved finger. "Calving supplies," Clara said, her voice steady, "and a brooding hen. Go in there and you'll scare her off her clutch, and then you can explain to my mother why we have no eggs for breakfast." Cletus stared at her for a long, agonizing second. Then, he grunted and spat tobacco juice onto the clean floor. "All right. But keep your doors locked, miss. This fella, he's a killer. Shot 2 deputies in Laramie. I can take care of myself," Clara said coldly. Cletus mounted up and rode out, leaving the doors swinging in the wind. Clara rushed to bar them, her legs finally giving way. She slid down the wood, gasping for air. She didn't have time to recover. She ran back to the tack room and relit the lantern. Silas was shivering violently now. The fever was setting in. "Water," he croaked. "I have to get the bullet out first," Clara said, rolling up her sleeves. "This is going to hurt." She didn't have whiskey, but she had her father's old flask of brandy hidden under a floorboard, one of the few things she'd kept. She took a swig herself to steady her nerves, then poured some over the blade of her small paring knife. "Bite down on this," she said, shoving a leather strap between his teeth. Silas looked at her, his gray eyes hazy with pain but startlingly intelligent. He nodded once. Clara had never performed surgery on a human. She dug thorns out of dogs and stitched up horses that had run into barbed wire. She prayed the anatomy wasn't too different. She placed the knife against the puckered skin. Silas groaned, his back arching off the floor. "Hold still," she commanded, pressing her weight onto his shoulder. For 20 minutes, the only sounds in the room were the hiss of the wind outside, the crackle of the stove, and the wet, slick sounds of Clara digging for lead. Her fingers were slippery with his blood. Sweat dripped from her forehead, stinging her eyes. Clink. She felt it. She grabbed the tweezers she used for sewing and clamped down. With a sickening squelch, she pulled the deformed lead slug free. Silas let out a guttural roar, muffled by the leather, and passed out cold. Clara tossed the bullet into a tin cup. She quickly poured the rest of the brandy into the wound to cauterize it, then packed it with a poultice of comfrey and yarrow she had gathered in the summer. She bound his chest tight with strips of a clean petticoat. She sat back, her hands covered in his blood. She looked at his face, relaxed in unconsciousness. He was handsome in a rugged, dangerous way. He had a scar running through his left eyebrow. She picked up his gun belt to move it away from him. It was heavy. As she set it down, A folded piece of paper fell out of the inner lining of the holster. Clara hesitated. It wasn't her business. But he had put her life in danger. She unfolded the paper. It was a wanted poster. But it wasn't for a bank robber. It was a poster for a man named Silas Kincaid. The charge wasn't robbery. It was murder of a federal officer. But underneath that, there was another paper. A handwritten letter, the ink smudged. Silas, you were right. The water rights in the valley weren't sold. They were stolen. I have the proof in the ledger. Meet me at the Holloway place. Samuel knows where it is. Clara stopped breathing. Samuel Holloway. Her father. This letter was dated 2 years ago. 2 days before her father died. Clara looked from the letter to the unconscious man. He wasn't a stranger. He knew her father. And he had come back to the place where her father died. The door behind her creaked. Clara spun around, hiding the letter behind her back. Standing in the doorway, wrapped in a quilt and holding a double-barreled shotgun, was her mother, Margaret. Move away from him, Clara, Margaret said, her voice devoid of emotion. I won't let a drifter bring ruin to this house. Step aside so I can finish what the cold started. Mama, no! Clara stood in front of Silas, spreading her arms. He's a criminal, Clara, Cletus told us. He knew Papa, Clara blurted out. Margaret lowered the gun slightly, her face pale in the lantern light. What did you say? He has a letter, Clara whispered, holding up the blood-stained paper. He knew Papa, and he knows something about the water rights. Mama, I don't think Papa's accident was an accident. Margaret walked forward, her hands trembling as she took the letter. She read it, tears filling her eyes. She looked down at Silas Kincaid, the man bleeding on her tackroom floor. If he dies, Margaret said, her voice hard as steel, the truth dies with him. You better be a good doctor, Clara. Because our lives depend on this cowboy waking up. For 3 days, the blizzard raged outside, sealing the Holloway ranch in a tomb of white. Inside the tackroom, a different kind of war was being fought. Silas burned with fever. He thrashed on the pallet, muttering names of men Clara didn't know. Jericho, Dutch, the kid. Clara barely slept. She spent her nights wringing out cold rags to place on his forehead and forcing willow bark tea between his cracked lips. Margaret was a constant, silent presence. She didn't help nurse him, but she didn't kick him out either. She sat in the corner on an upturned crate, shotgun across her lap, watching the outlaw with eyes that had seen too much grief. He talks in his sleep, Margaret said on the 3rd night, her voice rasping in the dim light. He talks about fire. About a ledger. He's delirious, Mama, Clara whispered, wiping sweat from Silas's brow. Her hand lingered on his cheek. The stubble was rough, but his skin was finally cooling. The fever was breaking. Don't get attached, Clara, Margaret warned, standing up. Men like him don't stay. They leave, or they die. Usually both. Before Clara could retort, the dogs on the front porch began to bark a vicious, snarling sound. Then came the heavy thud of hooves. Not one horse, a dozen. Clara's blood ran cold. The storm had broken, and with the clear skies came the law. Hide the bloody rags, Margaret hissed, snatching the basin of pink water. Get to the house. I'll handle them here. No. Clara stood up, smoothing her apron. If it's Rourke, he wants to see me. He won't leave until he does. Clara bolted the tackroom door from the outside, threw a heavy saddle blanket over it to conceal the cracks, and piled hay bales in front of it. It wasn't a perfect hiding spot, but it had to do. She ran to the main house, her boots slipping on the ice, and entered the kitchen just as a heavy fist pounded on the front door. She opened it to find Marshal Jedediah Rourke standing there. He was a bear of a man, dressed in a pristine buffalo coat that cost more than the Holloway ranch was worth. His silver star gleamed on his chest, but his eyes were dark and predatory. Marshal, Clara said, keeping her chin high. To what do we owe the pleasure? We haven't missed a payment, have we? Rourke smiled, a gesture that didn't reach his eyes. He stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, pulling off his gloves. "Now, Miss Clara, is that any way to greet a friend?" I was worried. "The storm was fierce. Just wanted to check on you and your mother." "We are fine," Clara said, moving to block his view of the back window that looked out toward the barn. "Are you?" Rourke walked around the kitchen, trailing a finger along the dusty mantel. "I heard rumors. My deputy, Cletus, said you were acting skittish the other night. Said you had the barn locked up tight. Cletus sees ghosts in his own shadow," Clara said. Rourke stopped in front of her. He was too close. She could smell the expensive tobacco and the stale whiskey on his breath. "I'm looking for a man, Clara. A dangerous man. Silas Kincaid. He killed a federal agent, stole a payroll shipment intended for the railroad expansion." Rourke leaned in. "If you're hiding him, that makes you an accessory, and the law is not kind to accessories, not even pretty ones." "I haven't seen anyone," Clara lied, her heart hammering against her ribs. Rourke studied her face, looking for a twitch, a flinch. "Is that so? Then you won't mind if my boys check the barn again, thoroughly this time. Pitchforks in the hay." Clara's stomach dropped. If they used pitchforks, they'd stab Silas. "Go ahead," Clara said, forcing a cold smile. "But if your men damage my winter feed, you'll be deducting the cost from our debt." Rourke chuckled. "Fair enough." He turned to the window. "Boys, search the barn. Poke every bale." Clara stood frozen. She couldn't stop them. Outside, she heard the shouting of men and the restless stomping of horses. She closed her eyes, praying. "Please stay quiet, Silas. Please don't move." 10 minutes passed. It felt like 10 years. Rourke watched her the whole time, seemingly enjoying her tension. Then, the back door flew open. It was Cletus. "Marshal!" Cletus yelled, breathless. Clara gripped the edge of the table. "This is it. It's over." "What is it?" Rourke demanded. "We found something in the lower pasture," Cletus said. "Tracks. Horse tracks leading toward the canyon. Fresh ones." Rourke's eyes snapped away from Clara. "The canyon?" "He's trying to double back to the pass." Rourke looked back at Clara, a flicker of suspicion still lingering. But the thrill of the hunt was stronger. He put his hat back on. "My apologies, Miss Holloway. Seems our bird has flown." He paused at the door. "Oh, and Clara? The payment on the note is due next week. I'd hate to foreclose. Perhaps we could come to another arrangement. Marriage would clear all debts." He winked, a greasy, terrifying expression, and walked out. Clara waited until the sound of the posse faded into the distance. Her knees gave out, and she sank to the floor. They hadn't found him. The tracks Cletus found must have been from a stray Mustang or a neighbor. She scrambled up and ran back to the barn. She tore the hay bales away from the tack room door and unbolted it. Inside, Silas was awake. He was sitting up, propped against the wall, his face pale as death. In his hand, he held his heavy Colt revolver, aimed steadily at the door. When he saw it was Clara, the barrel lowered, shaking. "I heard him," Silas rasped, his voice sounding like broken glass. "Rourke, he's gone," Clara whispered, rushing to his side. "They're chasing a ghost in the canyon." Silas looked at her, his gray eyes lucid for the first time in days. "Why?" he asked. "Why didn't you give me up? The reward money alone would save this ranch." Clara looked at the bandages on his chest, then at the letter sticking out of his saddlebag in the corner. "Because," she said softly, "you knew my father. And I think you're the only one who knows why he really died." The fever broke completely the next morning. Silas was weak as a newborn kitten, but the infection was receding. Clara brought him a bowl of broth and a piece of stale bread. He ate voraciously, his hands still trembling slightly. When he finished, he leaned back against the saddle Clara had propped behind him. The tack room was warm, smelling of cedar and the faint metallic tang of the dried blood on his coat. "You have your father's eyes," Silas said quietly. Clara froze, the spoon hovering over the bowl. You were his friend? I was his partner, Silas corrected. Before the war, we prospected together in the Dakotas. Samuel was the only honest man I ever met in a dishonest trade. The letter, Clara pressed, sitting on a crate opposite him. It said you were coming to meet him. It mentioned a ledger. Silas sighed, wincing as he shifted his wounded shoulder. 2 years ago, Samuel wrote to me. He said Rourke, who wasn't a marshal then, just a land agent, was pressuring the ranchers to sell. Samuel found out why. It wasn't for grazing. The railroad was coming through. Rourke knew the route before anyone else. He was buying land for pennies to sell it to the Union Pacific for millions. Clara's breath hitched. Papa refused to sell. Exactly. And he found proof of Rourke's insider dealings. A ledger. He kept records of bribes, forged deeds, everything. Samuel hid it. Silas looked down at his hands. I was coming to help him take it to the governor. But I was 2 days late. They said it was a riding accident, Clara said, bitterness coating her tongue. His horse threw him. Samuel could ride a tornado bareback, Silas scoffed. He was murdered, Clara. Rourke killed him to find that ledger. But he never found it, did he? No, Clara shook her head. We turned the house upside down looking for a will. We never found a ledger. That means it's still here, Silas said, his eyes narrowing. And as long as it's missing, Rourke can't rest. That's why he hasn't foreclosed on you yet. He needs access to the land to keep searching. The realization hit Clara like a physical blow. Her father hadn't just been unlucky. He had been a martyr. And her mother, did she know? I have to find it, Clara said, standing up. No, Silas barked, then coughed violently. No. You go poking around. Rourke will kill you too. This is my fight now. Your fight? Clara laughed without humor. Look at you, cowboy. You can't even stand up. You're a wanted man with a hole in his chest. What are you going to do? Silas looked at her, and for a moment, the hardness in his face softened. He saw the fire in her, the same stubbornness Samuel had possessed. I'm going to heal, Silas said softly. And then, I'm going to kill Jedediah Rourke. A silence stretched between them. It wasn't the silence of awkwardness, but of a pact being formed. You need to rest, Clara said, her voice gentler now. She reached out to adjust his blanket. As she leaned over, Silas's hand came up and caught hers. His skin was rough, calloused from years of gripping reins and gun handles, but his touch was surprisingly tender. Clara, he said. It was the first time he used her name. Thank you. For the surgery. For the silence. Clara felt a flush rise to her cheeks that had nothing to do with the heat of the stove. She looked into his steel-gray eyes and saw something dangerous there, not a threat, but a promise, a pull. I didn't do it for you, she whispered, though her heart was betraying her. I did it for the truth. Maybe, Silas murmured, his thumb brushing her knuckles. But I pay my debts. I promise you, Clara Holloway. I will get your land back. Whatever it costs. Clara pulled her hand away, flustered. Just get some sleep. She hurried out of the tack room, her pulse racing. She leaned against the cold wood of the barn door, taking deep breaths. She had expected a criminal. She had found an ally. And, God help her, she was starting to see the man beneath the outlaw. Over the next week, Silas improved rapidly. His strength was unnatural. By the 5th day, he was standing. By the 7th, he was helping her with small chores inside the barn, hidden from view. It was an intimate, quiet domesticity that Clara had never known. They spoke in whispers. He taught her how to oil a gun. She taught him which cows were stubborn. They shared meals in the dim lantern light, the space between them shrinking with every passing hour. One evening, as Clara was mending a bridle, Silas was cleaning his revolver. You never asked about the money, Silas said. What money? The payroll. The reason Rourke is hunting me. I don't care about stolen money, Clara said, not looking up. I didn't steal it for me. Silas said. He holstered the gun. I stole it to buy back the deeds Rourke took from the other families. I was going to return it to the people. Clara looked at him. He was a Robin Hood in a dusted coat. You're a fool, Silas Kincaid. She smiled. Maybe. He grinned back, a rare, boyish expression that made him look 10 years younger. But I'm alive. Suddenly, the barn door creaked. They both froze. It wasn't Margaret. The footsteps were heavy, accompanied by the jingle of spurs. Silas moved instantly, blowing out the lantern and pulling Clara into the shadows of the hayloft ladder. He pressed her against the wall, his body shielding hers, his gun drawn. "Miss Clara?" a voice called out. It wasn't Rourke. It was a young voice. Tobias, the stable boy from town who sometimes delivered messages. Clara let out a breath and stepped out, pushing Silas's gun arm down. "I'm here, Toby," she called out. "Don't sneak up on a girl." Tobias stood in the doorway, looking terrified. "Sorry, miss. But the marshal sent me. He said to tell you." The boy swallowed hard. "Tell me what?" He said he's tired of waiting. "He's coming for the foreclosure tomorrow at noon. And," he said, "he knows you bought men's boots at the general store last week." Clara's blood turned to ice. She had bought boots for Silas, whose own were ruined. Tobias ran off, terrified of being the messenger. Clara turned to Silas in the dark. The moon cut a sliver of light across his face. He looked grim. "He knows," Silas said. "He's coming for you. He's coming for the land." Clara said, her voice trembling. "He'll throw us out in the snow." "No," Silas said. He holstered his gun and grabbed his saddlebags. "He won't." "What are you doing?" Clara grabbed his arm. "I'm leaving," Silas said, his voice hard. "If I'm not here, he has no excuse to arrest you. I'll draw him off. I'll ride toward the Badlands." "You'll die," Clara cried. "You're not healed enough to ride hard." "Better me than you," Silas said. He looked at her, his gaze intense. "Clara, you saved my life. Let me save yours." He moved to saddle his horse. Clara watched him, panic rising in her throat. She couldn't let him go. Not because of the plan, not because of the ledger, but because she couldn't bear the thought of him dying alone in the snow. "Wait," Clara said, a desperate idea forming in her mind. "Don't go. There's another way." Silas paused, his hand on the saddle horn. "What way?" Clara stepped into the moonlight. "The ledger. I think I know where it is." Sela stared at her. "Where?" "Papa didn't hide it in the house," she said, her eyes wide with realization. "He was a religious man, Silas, but he didn't go to church. So, he built this barn," Clara said, looking up at the rafters. "He called it his sanctuary. And the post, the main support post." She ran to the center of the barn, to the massive oak beam that held up the roof. Carved into the wood at eye level was a Bible verse. "The truth shall set you free." "It's hollow," Clara whispered. She grabbed a crowbar from the wall. With a grunt, she pried at the wood panel behind the carving. It groaned, then popped loose. Dust fell, and there, tucked into a hollowed-out compartment in the beam, was a thick, black leather book. Silas walked over, his boots silent on the hay. He took the book and opened it. Even in the moonlight, the columns of numbers and Rourke's signature were visible. "This is it," Silas breathed. "This hangs him." "We have the proof," Clara said, breathless. "We do," Silas said. He looked at the book, then at Clara. "But Rourke is coming tomorrow at noon. We can't get this to the governor in Cheyenne in time." "Then we don't go to Cheyenne," Clara said, a dangerous strength filling her voice. "We wait. If Rourke wants a fight, we'll give him one." Silas looked at her, and for the first time, he didn't see a rancher's daughter. He saw a partner. "All right," Silas said, checking the cylinder of his Colt. "Tomorrow at noon, we welcome the marshal to hell." The dawn of November 22nd broke like a bruised plum over the Wyoming horizon, purple, cold, and unforgiving. Inside the Holloway barn, the air was thick with tension and the smell of gun oil. Margaret Holloway, a woman who had spent the last 2 years mourning, had transformed. She sat on a hay bale, her gray hair pulled back into a severe knot, loading buckshot into her husband's double-barreled shotgun with steady hands. "He'll bring more than Cletus," Margaret said, snapping the breech closed. "Rourke isn't a fool. If he's coming to foreclose, he'll bring the magistrate. If he's coming to kill, he'll bring hired guns from the rail camp." Silas stood by the loft window, peering through a crack in the wood. He had cleaned his Colt .45 and the Winchester rifle Clara had retrieved from the house. He moved with a stiff grace, the wound in his chest a dull ache that he shoved to the back of his mind. "He's coming to kill," Silas said grimly. "He knows the ledger is missing. He can't risk a trial. He needs this ranch to be a graveyard." Clara was boarding up the lower windows. She paused, hammer in hand, looking at the two people she loved most in the world. Her mother, finally fighting back, and Silas, the stranger who had become her anchor. "We have the high ground in the barn," Silas instructed, turning to them. "Margaret, you take the tack room door. Keep it cracked. Anything that tries to flank us, you give them both barrels. Clara, you're up in the loft with the rifle. You're a better shot at distance than I am right now." "And you?" Clara asked, her voice tight. "I'll be at the main doors," Silas said. "I'm the one they want. I'll make sure they see me." "You're using yourself as bait," Clara accused, dropping the hammer. Silas walked over to her. The morning light caught the sharp angles of his face, softening the outlaw edges. "I'm the reason they're here, Clara. It's the only way to draw their fire away from you." Clara shook her head, tears stinging her eyes. "No. We're in this because Rourke killed my father. You just gave us the courage to fight back." Silas reached out, cupping her face in his rough hands. His thumbs brushed away a stray tear. The world outside the snow, the impending violence. The debt faded away. "Clara," he whispered, "I've spent my whole life running, looking for a score, looking for a fight. I never thought I'd find something worth standing still for." "Silas, listen to me," he said, his voice dropping to a fierce murmur. "If this goes bad, if they breach the doors, you take that ledger and you run. You go out the hay drop in the back and you don't stop until you hit the tree line. Do you understand? I'm not leaving you," Clara sobbed. "You have to," Silas said, "because you're the only good thing I've ever done, and I'll be damned if I let Rourke snuff you out." He didn't give her time to argue. He leaned down and kissed her. It wasn't a tentative, shy kiss. It was desperate and consuming, tasting of coffee and fear, and a love that had bloomed in the shadow of death. Clara gripped his coat, pulling him closer, pouring every ounce of her hope into him. When they pulled apart, breathless, Silas rested his forehead against hers. "Now get up to the loft." Clara grabbed the Winchester and climbed the ladder, her heart thudding a war drum in her chest. She settled into the hay, leveling the rifle barrel through the opening. The hours dragged. 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock. At noon, exactly as the church bell in town would be tolling, the ground began to tremble. They came over the ridge. Not 5 men, not 10, 15 riders. Marshal Rourke rode in the center, flanked by Deputy Cletus, and a dozen men in long dusters who looked like they'd kill their own mothers for $1. They fanned out in a semicircle around the ranch yard, cutting off the escape routes. Rourke raised a hand, and the riders stopped. The silence was deafening. "Clara Holloway," Rourke's voice boomed, carried by the wind. "By the power vested in me in the territory of Wyoming, I am here to execute a writ of foreclosure. Vacate the premises immediately, or be removed by force." Silas stepped out from the shadows of the barn door, just enough to be seen. He didn't have a gun in his hand. He held a lit cigar. "You're a long way from your jurisdiction, Jedediah," Silas shouted back. The riders shifted nervously. Rourke's horse stamped the snow. "Kincaid," Rourke sneered. "I knew you were the rat in the woodpile. You're looking well for a dead man." "I'm hard to kill," Silas replied calmly, "unlike Samuel Holloway. You didn't give him a chance to fight back, did you?" Rourke's face darkened. I don't know what you're talking about. Boys, this man is a cop killer. Shoot on sight. Wait. Clara screamed from the loft window. She stood up, visible to everyone, holding the black ledger high above her head. I have the book, Rourke, she yelled, her voice ringing clear and true. I have the ledger, every bribe, every stolen deed. I have the dates you paid off the surveyor to route the train through our valley. A ripple of shock went through the posse. The hired guns looked at each other. They were paid to evict a widow, not cover up a federal conspiracy. Rourke's face went purple. She's lying. It's a trick. It's in your handwriting, Jedediah, Clara shouted. I've already made a copy and sent it to the governor with the Morning Post. It was a lie, a desperate gamble, but it hit Rourke like a physical blow. You little witch, Rourke snarled. He drew his pearl-handled revolver. Kill them. Kill them all. Burn the barn to the ground. No witnesses. Cletus, the deputy, looked at Rourke. Marshal. Burn it? But the women. Bang. Rourke shot Cletus in the back of the head. The deputy fell from his horse, dead before he hit the snow. The other riders froze. Anyone else have a conscience? Rourke roared, waving his smoking gun. $500 to the man who brings me that ledger and the girl's head. The hesitation broke. Money outweighed morality. The hired guns spurred their horses forward, raising their rifles. Now, Silas yelled. The barn exploded into chaos. Clara squeezed the trigger of the Winchester. The recoil punched her shoulder, but her aim was true. A rider on a roan horse threw up his arms and fell backward into the snow. Below, Silas was a blur of motion. He kicked the barn door shut just as a hail of bullets splintered the wood. He dove behind a stack of grain sacks, firing through a knothole. His Colt barked rhythmically. 1, 2, 3, and 2 men outside screamed, clutching their legs. Mama! Now! Clara shrieked. A hired gun had dismounted and was sprinting toward the side door. The door flew open, and Margaret Holloway stood there like an avenging angel. The shotgun roared, boom. The man flew backward as if kicked by a mule. Margaret slammed the door and barred it, her hands shaking but her face stony. They're flanking right, Silas yelled, reloading his cylinder with practiced speed. Clara, watch the roof. Bullets shredded the barn walls. Sunlight pierced through the new holes, beams of light dancing in the dust and gun smoke. Clara worked the lever of her rifle. Crack. She missed. Crack. She hit a man trying to light a torch, but there were too many of them. Rourke stayed back, barking orders, cowardice keeping him out of range. Lanterns, Rourke screamed. Light the lanterns and throw them. 3 men lit kerosene lanterns and galloped toward the barn, staying low on their horses. Clara shot one, the lantern exploding in a ball of fire on the snow, spooking the horses, but the other 2 got close. They hurled the flaming glass against the dry, weathered wood of the barn wall. The glass shattered, the oil spread, and in seconds, the hungry flames began to climb the wall. Fire! Clara screamed, the smoke already starting to curl up toward the loft. We have to move, Silas shouted. Margaret, get the horses out. Let them loose in the yard to create confusion. Margaret ran to the stalls, unlatching the gates. She slapped Bess the cow and the 2 draft horses on the rumps. The animals, terrified by the smell of smoke and the noise, stampeded toward the main doors. Open the main doors, Silas, Clara yelled, climbing down the ladder. Silas threw the bolt and heaved the doors open. The horses thundered out into the snow, screaming. The hired guns outside were taken by surprise. A stampede of terrified livestock scattered their formation. 2 riders were bucked off as their horses panicked. Now, run for the ravine, Silas commanded. He grabbed Margaret's arm and pushed her toward the back door. Clara was right behind them, clutching the ledger to her chest. They burst out the back door into the biting cold. The smoke from the burning barn was thick, billowing black clouds that masked their escape. There, by the creek, a voice shouted. A bullet whizzed past Clara's ear, snapping a twig. Go! Silas spun around, dropping to one knee. He fired blindly into the smoke, covering their retreat. Clara dragged her mother down the snowy embankment into the frozen creek bed. The high banks offered cover. They scrambled over slick rocks and ice, their breath tearing at their lungs. "Clara," Margaret gasped, stumbling. "I can't. My ankle." "You have to, Mama," Clara cried, pulling her up. They reached a cluster of boulders about 200 yards from the ranch. They collapsed behind them, gasping for air. Clara looked back. The barn was a towering inferno now. The flames roared into the sky, painting the snow orange. Her father's sanctuary, gone. "Where is Silas?" Margaret wheezed. Clara's heart stopped. She looked at the trail behind them. Empty. "Silas!" she screamed. "Stay down!" Margaret grabbed her skirt. "He's not here. He didn't follow us." Clara scrambled up the rocks, peering over the edge. Through the smoke, she saw a figure standing near the burning barn. Silas hadn't run. He had stayed behind to hold them off. He was pinned down behind the water trough, taking fire from 3 sides. He was out of ammunition for the rifle. He was down to his revolver. Rourke rode his horse through the smoke, looking like a demon. He saw Silas trapped. "Cease fire," Rourke yelled. The shooting stopped. Rourke trotted his horse closer, keeping his gun trained on Silas. "You're out of bullets, Kincaid." Rourke laughed, the sound manic. "And your women have nowhere to go. I'll hunt them down like rabbits once I'm done with you." Silas stood up slowly. He held his left arm. Blood was dripping from a fresh wound in his bicep. He looked exhausted, beaten. "Let them go, Rourke," Silas said, his voice raspy. "You want me. You want the ledger." "I have it," Clara gasped. He was lying. She had the ledger. "You have it?" Rourke narrowed his eyes. "It's in my coat," Silas lied. "Let them ride away, and I'll give it to you. Then you can shoot me." Rourke smiled. It was a victory smile. "Throw it here." Silas reached into his coat. Clara, watching from the rocks, knew what he was doing. He was going to draw, but Rourke had his gun aimed right at Silas's heart. Silas would never be fast enough, not wounded, not against a gun already cocked. "No," Clara whispered. She looked at the heavy Winchester in her hands. The distance was long. The wind was swirling. Her hands were shaking. "Take a breath, Clara," she heard her father's voice. "Squeeze, don't pull." She rested the rifle on the granite boulder. She lined up the sights. Not on Rourke, he was moving too much on the horse. She aimed at the one thing that could change the odds. Silas's hand tightened on the grip of his hidden gun. Rourke's finger tightened on his trigger. Crack. Clara's shot rang out across the valley. She didn't hit Rourke. She hit the brass decorative buckle on Rourke's saddle girth. The leather strap snapped. Rourke's saddle slipped sideways violently. The marshal, caught off guard, flailed, his gun firing harmlessly into the sky as he tumbled into the snow. "Silas!" Clara screamed. The distraction was all Silas needed. In a heartbeat, the exhausted outlaw vanished. He drew his Colt with lightning speed. Bang! Bang! 2 of the hired guns closest to him dropped. Rourke scrambled in the snow, trying to find his gun, screaming for his men to kill him. But the hired men were hesitating. The barn was gone. The deputy was dead. The helpless women were sniping them from the hills, and the outlaw was a demon who wouldn't die. "I'm done," one of the hired guns yelled, turning his horse. "This ain't worth dying for." "Me neither," another shouted. They began to scatter, riding hard away from the flames. Rourke was alone. He found his gun and scrambled to his feet, his face a mask of pure hatred. He didn't look for cover. He charged at Silas, firing wildly. Silas stood his ground. He raised his Colt. Click. Empty. Silas froze. Rourke stopped 10 feet away, panting, leveling his revolver at Silas's head. "Goodbye, partner," Rourke hissed. Suddenly, a shadow loomed over Rourke. It wasn't Clara. It wasn't Margaret. It was Bess, the milk cow. Maddened by the fire and the noise, the 1,000-pound animal blindsided the marshal, slamming into him with the force of a freight train. Rourke went down with a sickening crunch. The wind knocked out of him, his gun flying into the burning embers of the barn. Silas didn't hesitate. He lunged forward, not for a weapon, but for Rourke. He grabbed the marshal by the collar and dragged him away from the fire, throwing him into the mud near the trough. Rourke gasped, reaching for a boot knife. Silas stepped on his wrist, hard. Rourke cried out. Silas stood over him, the flames of the barn reflecting in his cold gray eyes. That, Silas panted, pointing to the burning barn, was Samuel's legacy. You took it. He looked up toward the rocks where Clara was standing. Clara, bring the rope. The smoke from the Holloway barn rose in a black pillar that could be seen for 20 miles. It was a beacon that brought the neighbors' men from the valley, who had also been squeezed by Rourke's greed, but had been too afraid to fight. Until now, Silas Kincaid didn't run. He sat on the edge of the frozen water trough, his chest heaving, his left arm dripping blood onto the snow. At his feet, hog-tied with a lariat rope, lay Marshal Jedediah Rourke. The man who had terrorized Blackwood Creek was reduced to a sputtering, cursing heap in the mud. Clara walked down from the rocks, her face streaked with soot and tears. She held the black ledger against her chest like a shield. Margaret followed, limping, her shotgun broken open over her arm. It's over, Clara whispered, looking at the smoldering ruins of the barn. It's all gone. Everything. Silas stood up, wincing. He walked over to her, ignoring Rourke's venomous glare. He reached out and gently took the ledger from her shaking hands. Not everything, Silas said. He nodded toward the road. Riders were coming. But they weren't hired guns. It was Doc Sivers, the Reverend, and a dozen ranchers from the valley. They had seen the fire. They had heard the shooting. Help! Rourke screamed, thrashing in the mud. These two, they're murderers. They burned the barn. Arrest them. Doc Sivers rode up, his old face grim. He looked at the burning barn, then at Rourke tied up, and finally at Silas, the wanted man, standing tall beside the widow's daughter. What happened here, Clara? The doc asked. Justice, Clara said, her voice finding its steel. She held up the ledger. Rourke killed my father. He's been stealing land for the railroad, and I have the proof right here. Every bribe, every forged signature. Rourke went pale. She's lying. It's a forgery. And the men who attacked us? Silas growled, stepping forward. The ones who ran when the tide turned? They'll talk, Jedediah. Men like that always do when the hangman's noose gets close, the ranchers murmured. They had all suspected Rourke. Now, looking at the desperation in the marshal's eyes, they knew. Take him, Doc Sivers ordered the men. Lock him in his own jail cell until the circuit judge arrives from Cheyenne. As they hauled Rourke away, screaming threats, silence descended on the ranch. The adrenaline faded, leaving only the cold wind and the smell of ash. Clara looked at Silas. He looked exhausted. The bandage on his chest was soaked through again. You should go, Clara said, her voice cracking. Before the judge comes, you're still a wanted man, Silas. The ledger proves Rourke is crooked, but it doesn't clear your name for the robbery. Silas looked at his horse, which had wandered back to the corral. He looked at the open plains, the freedom he had always chased. Then he looked at Clara at her fierce eyes, her soot-stained cheek, the way she stood protecting her mother. I promised you, Silas said softly. I pay my debts. You saved our lives, Margaret said, stepping forward. She placed a hand on his good arm. Consider the debt paid. Not yet, Silas said. He turned and walked toward the smoking ruins of the barn. The heat was still intense, but the main structure had collapsed, leaving only the stone foundation and the blackened stump of the central post where the ledger had been hidden. What are you doing? Clara called out. Silas pointed to the base of the central post. The heat of the fire had been hottest there. The wood had burned away completely, and the stone beneath had cracked from the thermal shock. Something was glittering in the ashes, a dull, heavy yellow. Silas used a shovel to push aside the embers. He reached down with a gloved hand and pulled out a heavy, misshapen lump of metal. It had been molten, melted by the inferno, and had pooled in the cracked rock before hardening again. He walked back and dropped it into Clara's hands. It was heavy. Gold, Silas said. Raw, unrefined gold. Clara stared at it. Papa. He was a prospector. He always said he was saving for a rainy day. He buried his stash under the main post, Silas said, a small smile touching his lips. He knew Rourke would tear the house apart looking for money or the ledger, but he never thought Rourke would burn the barn. The fire revealed it. Margaret whispered, tears streaming down her face. He was looking out for us. Even from the grave. That lump is worth $5,000. Easy, Silas said. Enough to rebuild the barn, enough to buy new herd stock, enough to be free of debt forever. Clara looked from the gold to Silas. It's enough to hire the best lawyer in the territory, enough to fight for a pardon. Silas stiffened. Clara, don't you dare ride away, Silas Kincaid, Clara said, dropping the gold into the snow and grabbing his coat lapels. Don't you dare leave me with a fortune and a broken heart. You said you wanted to stop running. You said you wanted something worth standing still for. She gestured to the land, to the mountains, to the spot where they had fought side by side. Is this worth it? She asked. Silas looked at her. He saw the future in her eyes. It wasn't a life of looking over his shoulder. It was a life of hard work, cold winters and warm nights. A life of peace. He took her hands in his. I reckon, Silas said, his voice thick with emotion, that I'm done running. I think I'll stay right here. Clara smiled, a radiant expression that outshone the gold in the snow. She pulled him down for a kiss, not a desperate kiss of goodbye, but a slow, promising kiss of hello. The wind howled around them, but for the first time in 2 years, the Holloway Ranch wasn't cold. It was warm with the promise of spring and the fire of a love that had survived the storm. And so, the winter that should have ended the Holloway line became their new beginning. Marshall Rourke was hanged for his crimes 3 months later, his own ledger serving as the testimony that condemned him. The gold found in the ashes rebuilt the ranch, grander than before. But the true treasure wasn't the metal in the ground. Silas Kincaid was granted a full pardon, thanks to the testimony of Clara and the recovery of the stolen railroad funds. He hung up his gun belt and picked up a hammer, building a life alongside the woman who had healed his body and saved his soul. They say if you visit Blackwood Creek today, you can still see the foundation of the old barn, a monument to the day a widow's daughter and an outlaw stood against the world and won. If this story of justice, redemption, and wild romance captured your heart, please hit that like button. It helps us bring more untold legends to life. Don't forget to share this video with a friend who loves a good Western, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss a saga. What do you think Silas whispered to Clara at their wedding? Let me know in the comments below.